Your fantasy world can be a really complex thing, and there's so many moving parts to keep track of. One of the most overlooked parts is the economy. If you handle it right, you can add a ton and a half of depth that wouldn't exist otherwise, but if you handle it wrong, you're going to make everything feel fake. The first thing you have to decide when it comes to making your economy is how true to life and historically accurate do you want it to be? There was, historically speaking, an absolutely massive wealth gap. Now, you may hear that scoff and say that there's a massive wealth gap right now, but historically speaking, it was way, way, way worse. We're talking about like a normal pie costing days worth of a regular person's wages, or a purple cloak costing weeks worth. And this is a cheap shade of purple we're talking about. If someone was super, super lucky, they'd maybe taste sugar one time in their entire life. Now you can get pounds of it at the store for a couple dollars. They make you buy a massive amount of sugar these days, and that's why the purchase does end up being expensive even in the modern day. But keep in mind, you're buying way more sugar than a lot of actual kings would have seen over the course of their entire life in one rip. Meanwhile, the rich would start private fire departments because institutionalized fire departments didn't become a thing until like the last couple hundred years. They would own several thousand-acre estates, and they would feast for days at a time in a setting where people barely ever got to eat meat. And they do it wearing as many purple clothes as they want, the best shade, with hundreds of slaves to tend to them. It's like having multi-billionaires, not on paper, but ones with multi-billion-dollar net worths of actual liquid assets right beside people that make a few pennies a day. Throughout history, swords and armor were the kind of thing that you could only afford if you were of a certain social standing, or won a big tournament, or you saved up for an absurd amount of time. Most conscripts would go into war with just a helmet and a spear pretty much. Like, they'd wear clothes as well, sometimes with some extra padding and whatnot, but pretty much only the most lucky ones even had some kind of leather type of armor, and in rare scenarios they would have mail and whatnot, but a lot of the time that was pretty much exclusively reserved for people that were actual career soldiers. Now, that's just something to consider, but your fantasy world can be way more abundant than that, obviously, because consider, how would magic affect your world and your economy? The price of stuff like gold and silver and construction costs. Odds are, magic makes it quite easy to get all of those materials and maybe even to convert them into their refined form. It's totally reasonable for you to have an economy that's as abundant as like 1960s America, because magic makes that a feasible thing. Now that we've touched on that, though, the next big question is, what are you actually using for currency? In real life, coins of all different kinds of metal have been used, but they've also used things like clamshells or even giant stone discs that would weigh hundreds or even thousands of pounds. And these discs, it's not like you'd walk around with them and actually physically give them to somebody. They'd most likely be dropped off in a location, hang out there, and never get physically moved. You would just verbally agree, hey, this is your stone now, and you know, these little ones are my stones now. In the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, they use gemstones as currency. They put them in little glass orbs, and these gemstones will start to glow after a storm comes by. Stormlight is the magic system, and it will brighten up these natural crystals and stuff, which are polished and all that. The value of a specific gem encased in a glass orb is directly correlated to what kind of gem it is and all that. Now, the reason I touch on that is to say maybe there's something in your fantasy story that makes a lot more sense to use as currency than just some kind of metal. But if you decide to use metal, here are some things you can consider factoring into your story to add some realism. Depending on the place and the time period, sometimes you were allowed to actually cut up the coin, hack it into pieces as a sort of way of making change. Now, a lot of the time this is because they cared more about the actual weight of the metal than the integrity of the coin itself, but that's besides the point. In other places, there were very, very strict laws about not being able to do that because each coin had to weigh a specific amount, and any taking away from that would debase the currency. The laws came about because people would scrape or clip the edges of the coin off. They try to do it subtly and just get little shavings and stuff. That's what led to the edges of coins being ridged, and in a lot of places today, you'll notice the edges of coins are still ridged. These people, they'd be collecting those clippings as scrap metal, and eventually they'd either melt them down or bring them in, and they would exchange them at the scrap metal value. Another thing to consider, a lot of the times different places would use vastly different coins. Like maybe it's the same metal, but one's way bigger than the other or way thinner than the other. In those scenarios, what they would typically do is they would take out a scale and they'd weigh the coins against each other. And if it was balanced or close enough, they'd make the trade. If it wasn't balanced, then, they'd have to negotiate or try to persuade the person to take the deal. And the deal would probably end up going in favor of whoever cares the least or doesn't need the deal as much. Maybe your character's from a foreign land and he doesn't want people to know, but his coins are going to expose him and he has to buy supplies. He has to have food. Some shelter would be nice. Some water, he's going to need that for sure too. Maybe it's not that basic. Maybe he needs to buy some sort of really important item, something for the plot that they absolutely need. But again, maybe they're on the run from the law. Maybe they're a foreign king that's just been deposed and they're trying to lay low and not get exposed. Now your character's got to find a way to make this deal happen without getting caught. Now they got to find a way to do this deal with somebody they trust, or at least somebody that's not going to care enough to oust them or think it's weird. What if your character is in some kind of ruin and as part of a mystery, they stumble across a chest of coins or something? By looking at the person depicted on the coin, they can tell what era or what region the money is from, and they can use that as an indicator to help them know, oh, hey, we're in the right place, this is the right ruin. Or, wow, now we know that we're getting a lot closer to this artifact we're searching for. A lot of coins also have something written on them. For example, when Augustus took over, his coins said Son of the Divine on them in Latin. Now, maybe your character reads that and they have no idea who the person is on the coin and they don't know what the other side depicts, but they've seen that language even if they don't understand it, and that's what makes them know they're in the right spot. When it comes to economy and currency, it's not like you make it the focus of your story, unless it actively makes sense to, of course. But it is a way to add in realism and authenticity. Once again, like so many other aspects of world building, It's the kind of thing you sprinkle in here and there, and it pays dividends. It makes it feel like a real world with real people living in it, and it makes the story come together in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. Now, that's all I have for today, so if you got any questions, make sure to leave them down in the comments section below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.